"Lovely dress," his father said in English. Then in German he muttered, "She looks cheap." The dining room fell silent. Crystal glasses trembled in midair. Candlelight flickered across polished silver, the quiet hum of the chandelier suddenly too loud. I smiled, raised my glass, and replied in perfect German. "You could have heard a pin drop." That's how it started, not a battlefield, not a storm, not an explosion in some foreign desert. Just a dinner table in Boston one day before my wedding. And yet somehow this was the fight that would test everything I'd learned about restraint, honor, and dignity. The text had come that afternoon. "Dad invited you to dinner tonight, just us, before the wedding." It was from Ethan, my fiancé, a man with a good heart but a heart often trapped in the shadows of his father's expectations. We'd met 2 years earlier when his firm provided legal counsel for the Navy's humanitarian partnership in Florida after a hurricane. I'd been serving as a naval intelligence officer attached to a SEAL team logistics coordination and post-mission assessments. He'd been the guy with the suit, the smile, and a notepad full of questions about procurement procedures. It wasn't love at first sight, but it was respect at first word. Over time we found middle ground, the disciplined officer and the careful lawyer. He loved my calm, I loved his kindness. But when I met his parents for the first time, I could sense it, that unspoken wall between their world and mine. His father, Richard Whitmore, was a retired diplomat, the kind who still wore cufflinks at breakfast and spoke of countries as if they were chess pieces. His mother, Margaret, quiet, elegant, and emotionally hidden behind porcelain politeness. I didn't resent them, I just knew they didn't see me as their kind. That evening I stood in front of my small apartment mirror dress, simple but refined hair pinned neatly my uniform long since stored away. I didn't want to show up as Lieutenant Commander Harper Lane, U.S. Navy SEAL intelligence officer. I wanted to show up as Ethan's fiancée, a woman ready to start a new chapter, not relive the old. The Whitmore estate sat on a hill outside Boston, white columns, ivy stone driveways, the kind of house that looked like it had never known dust. A butler opened the door before I could even knock. Inside, soft jazz floated through the air. Richard stood by the fireplace, whiskey in hand. Ethan smiled nervously. Margaret offered a brief hug as delicate as her pearls. Harper Richard said, "So glad you could make it. We thought a quiet dinner would be grounding before the big day." Grounding, that word carried weight. I thanked him, sat down, and accepted the wine he poured, red, expensive, unnecessary. The first few minutes were civil. Questions about the wedding, the guest list, honeymoon plans. Then Richard began his subtle probing. "So Harper," he said, "you're with the Navy, correct?" "Yes, sir, intelligence and field coordination." "Ah, and this SEAL assignment you've been on, quite unusual for women, isn't it?" I smiled lightly, less unusual than it used to be. He nodded, swirling his glass. Still a demanding life. Dangerous, too. Not exactly ideal for raising a family. "Neither is diplomacy," I said softly. "Different kind of danger." Ethan's fork froze mid-air. Margaret coughed. Richard gave a polite chuckle. Touché. He shifted languages, speaking in German to a family friend at the end of the table. My ears caught every word. I'd spent months working with German operatives in NATO missions. Understanding their language had saved lives more than once. "Sie ist hübsch," he said, "aber sie sieht billig aus. She's pretty, but she looks cheap." It was quiet low enough for him to think I wouldn't notice. But I did. And for a moment I felt that old sting, the one every working-class daughter feels when facing a man who measures worth in inheritance. I set my wineglass down, smiled, and said in German, "Manchmal täuscht der Anzug mehr als das Kleid. Sometimes the suit deceives more than the dress." The room froze. Richard's eyebrows shot up. The guests blinked. Ethan looked between us like a man watching a fuse burn. Then I lifted my glass again, took a small sip, and continued the conversation as if nothing had happened. Dinner stumbled forward after that. The clinking of forks became hesitant. Small talk returned, awkward and forced. Margaret asked about my parents. "My father runs a small auto shop in Des Moines," I said. "He taught me how to rebuild a carburetor before I could drive." "Ah," Richard muttered. "Self-made then." The word self-made sounded like an insult. I looked him straight in the eye. "Proudly, yes." He didn't reply. By dessert, Ethan looked pale. The tiramisu went untouched. The evening dragged like a mission gone wrong, no visible enemy, just subtle hostility in the air. When it was finally over, I stood and thanked them for the dinner. My voice was calm, my posture upright, my tone respectful. "Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore. The meal was wonderful." Richard nodded stiffly. "Of course, always good to meet family before commitments are made." The way he said commitments carried the weight of an unspoken if. I turned to leave but paused at the door. My reflection caught in a framed photograph Richard shaking hands with a foreign general, all smiles, medals glinting. And suddenly I wasn't angry anymore. I was just disappointed. On the drive back, Boston's lights blurred against the windshield. I replayed his words again and again. "She looks cheap." I'd been insulted by warlords, ignored by commanders, and underestimated by men twice his caliber. None of it had stung like this. Because this wasn't about power, it was about place. And for the first time I realized I didn't need to belong in his world. I'd already earned mine. When I parked, Ethan texted, "Sorry about tonight, he's just old-fashioned." I typed and deleted several responses before finally writing, "Don't apologize for someone who isn't sorry." Then I turned off the phone, sat in silence, and let the city hum around me. That night, I pulled an old photograph from a drawer my father and me covered in grease from rebuilding a motorcycle. His handwriting on the back. "Don't let anyone tell you your worth. You show them." I smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't come from victory but from understanding what battle you no longer need to fight. Tomorrow would bring clarity, one way or another. For now, I just whispered to myself. He spoke German, I spoke dignity. The chandelier hummed, and no one moved. A candle wick sputtered, a bead of wax rolled down like a slow tear. I could feel the room weighing my sentence. Richard recovered first. He lifted his glass not to toast, but to hide the way his mouth tightened. "You speak German," he said in English, as if labeling a specimen. "I learned because I needed to," I said. "People hear you differently when you make the effort." He nodded once the smallest concession a proud man can offer. Margaret's eyes softened, then retreated. Ethan was all apology without words. Dinner resumed technically. Knives chimed against bone china, but the music had gone out of the room. The quartet on the speakers belonged to a different party, a different house where no one had wounded anyone. Richard tried small talk. "So tell me, Harper, what exactly does intelligence officer mean, files analysis?" "Sometimes it means maps and timing," I said. "Sometimes it means putting a name to a voice on a radio you can't see. Sometimes it means translating what a man really means when he's trying not to say it." Ethan winced, but I kept my tone gentle. I wasn't there to win. I was there to hold the line. A silver-haired friend at the end of the table ventured a smile. "You must have stories." "I do," I said. "Most belong to people who didn't get a seat at a table like this." No one had a reply to that. Coffee arrived. I declined wine and asked for water clarity first, celebration later. Richard swirled his glass as if to remind me what cost and pedigree looked like when poured. "Tell me about your family," Margaret said, kind enough but wrapped in inspection paper. "My dad runs a garage in Des Moines," I said. "Mom taught second grade until her knees went. We didn't take many vacations. We fixed things and took casseroles to neighbors." "Blue collar," Richard said quickly, almost with relief, as if the label explained the rest. "Skilled," I said, "and generous." The friend chuckled to soften it. "We need both kinds in this country, right? Kindness that stung anyway." Ethan set his fork down. "Dad, we invited Harper to feel welcome." Richard gave him the diplomat's gaze. "And she is. I'm simply trying to understand the life she chooses. Military service is admirable, it's also consuming. Marriage requires presence." He angled the last sentence toward me. "It does," I said. "So does this family, I gather." He held my eyes. You could almost hear the chess clock between us. Margaret bridged the gap. "Ethan says you volunteer at a VA hospital." "I do," I said. "Paperwork reading to folks, sometimes just sitting. Quiet company can be medicine." Her face changed. My father used to say that she whispered, "He served in Korea." We had a thin strip of common ground, rough but real. Richard stepped off it first. "The wedding," he said, brisk. "Have you considered postponing Ethan's firm notes, a possible rotation overseas?" "Dad," Ethan warned. I set my napkin down flat and neat. If postponing gives your family peace, I'll discuss it with your son, privately. For a second, I saw not a diplomat but a father unused to negotiation. Peace comes from certainty, he said. My concern is stability. The life you've chosen, Lieutenant Commander, is not stable. I thought of flood maps stacked on my desk at base, the phone numbers of church basements that become shelters, the next of kin lists that live in bottom drawers. Stability, I said, is a promise people make to each other. Jobs come and go, fortunes too. Promises, that's the ground. Margaret closed her eyes. Ethan studied the tablecloth. The friend clinked his spoon. The cake is stunning, he said, nodding at a confection on the sideboard. Imported almond paste. The rescue attempt didn't hold. Richard pushed back his chair. Harper, would you join me in the study? A sentence like a subpoena. Ethan started to rise. Richard stopped him with 2 fingers. Just Harper. I followed him past oil portraits of people who'd never worried about rent. The study smelled of leather and diplomacy books that played well on camera, a globe the size of a small moon awards that caught light. He didn't sit. You embarrassed me, he said. No, I said. You embarrassed yourself. I refused to carry it for you. You could have ignored it. I've ignored worse when it served the mission, I said. This wasn't a mission. This was your table. He took a breath. I don't dislike you. That's good, I said, because I don't require your liking to keep my word to your son. What I require is respect. Yours is optional. Mine isn't. He stared at the globe. You and I were born into different countries. Same country, I said, different neighborhoods. A brief, honest smile. You're quick. I'm trained. We are not a cruel family, he said, quieter. We are careful. Careful people test things before they trust them. I've been tested by better, I said, then softened it. You don't have to like my dress, but you do have to tell the truth at your own table. He exhaled the sound of a man handed his reflection when he'd asked for a mirror. A small nod. Not concession, recognition. We returned. A slice of cake waited at my place. Margaret watched us with worry she couldn't hide. Ethan's fingers drummed the chair rail Morse code for, please let this end well. Richard lifted his glass. To family, he said, and to the work of understanding. Not an apology but direction. We took it. Conversation slid toward logistics, seating charts, shuttle times practicalities that rescue a night from meaning too much. Margaret asked about my mother's dress. I described it, and admiration replaced envy. The friend told a story about getting lost in Oklahoma before GPS, and for a few minutes we were a table of Americans trading highway tales. When coffee came again, I accepted. Half calf if you have it, I said. The housekeeper nodded with a small smile, ordinary domestic older than pride. As we stood to leave, Richard extended a hand. I took it. His palm was warm, the shake measured. We will talk more tomorrow, he said. Or we won't, I answered. Either way, the wedding is between your son and me. He inclined his head, understood. Outside, the air tasted like rain that hadn't decided yet. Ethan walked me to the car. I should have stopped him, he said. No, I said. He should have stopped himself. We stood a moment, the engine ticking. Do you still want to get married tomorrow? He asked. I want to marry you, I said, but I won't marry into contempt. Decide what you're willing to stand up for. Call me before midnight. He touched my hand, then let go. I love you. I know, I said. Make it mean something. I drove with the window cracked, Boston's bricks breathing out the day. At a stoplight, I watched a father hoist a sleepy child outside an ice cream shop. The kid dropped his spoon. The man laughed, kissed the sticky hair. Nothing expensive. Everything valuable. Back home, I hung the dress, lined up the shoes, boiled water for tea. I wrote a note, promises are the ground. I switched off the kitchen light and let the apartment settle. My phone stayed face down until its screen lit the room at 11:57. It was Ethan. The screen glowed in the dark. 11:57 p.m. incoming call, Ethan. I let it ring once before answering. Harper. His voice was softer than usual, stripped of confidence. Dad's upset. He thinks tonight got out of hand. Out of hand, I repeated, staring at the reflection of city lights in the window. All I did was answer him, in his language. He didn't mean it like that. Then how did he mean it? There was a pause, the kind that tells you truth is being weighed against loyalty. He said you embarrassed him in front of his colleagues. And maybe you could apologize tomorrow just to smooth things out before the wedding. I closed my eyes. You want me to apologize for being fluent? That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying, Ethan? He sighed. I just want peace. Peace, I repeated. Funny. Some people spend their lives fighting for it. Others just avoid discomfort and call it the same thing. The line went silent. Finally, he whispered, maybe we should postpone. Just a week or two. Maybe, I said, sleep on it. Then I hung up. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of Boston dawn that smells like metal and tide. I brewed coffee not for comfort, but routine, something predictable, in a world that suddenly wasn't. The news played in the background traffic politics, a brief segment about the Navy's Relief Coordination Center preparing for hurricane season. They showed footage from Norfolk trucks being loaded sailors in rain gear. I recognized the base before the announcer said the name. That had been my team 2 months ago. We'd pulled 39 civilians out of a flooded nursing home before the levee gave way. Nobody had cared what uniform I wore then or what my father did for a living. Out there, worth was measured in what you could lift, fix, or save. I turned off the TV. The contrast felt too sharp. By 10 a.m., my phone buzzed again, this time a message from Margaret. Harper, I hope you're resting. Richard may have spoken too harshly. He regrets how the evening ended. Please, give him time. I appreciated the effort, even if it came wrapped in diplomacy. I typed a short reply. Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. I understand. Then I packed a small duffel, not for running away, just habit. A SEAL officer never stays unprepared. When I stepped outside, the air was crisp. My neighbor, Mrs. Grant, retired schoolteacher widowed 15 years, waved from her porch. Morning, Lieutenant. Morning, ma'am. You look like you're thinking heavy thoughts, she said. I smiled faintly. Family dinner. You know how those go. She chuckled. Oh, honey, I taught 30 years of parent-teacher meetings. I've seen every flavor of pride. Sometimes it just takes a few bruises to ripen a man's humility. Her words lingered longer than she knew. That afternoon, I went to the VA hospital in South Boston. The halls smelled of antiseptic and quiet courage. I read aloud to a blind veteran named Frank who'd served in Vietnam. His hands trembled when he turned imaginary pages. Miss Harper, he said you sound tired today. I admitted, dinner party fatigue. He chuckled. Ah, the dangerous kind. People don't die in those, but they sure lose something. Respect, I said. He nodded slowly. My wife's father once told her I wasn't fit company for their daughter. Guess what I did? What? Married her anyway, 52 years. What changed his mind, I asked. War didn't. Medals didn't. Time did. He outlived his pride, and then he called me son. By then, I didn't need to hear it. I smiled. Sounds familiar. You Navy folks, he said, you learned patience. That's half of war. And the other half? Knowing which battles don't deserve you. Driving home, the sky opened up a slow, steady rain that blurred the edges of everything. I pulled over by the harbor, watching waves slap against the rocks. Somewhere out there, ships rolled in darkness, men and women standing watch without complaint. It struck me then how different courage looks depending on where you stand. Some people see it in speeches, others in silence. I turned off the wipers, closed my eyes, and let the sound of rain fill the car. Maybe that's what this was, not a loss but a lesson. The next morning, Ethan didn't call, but his mother did. Harper, dear, Ethan's upset. He says you two need space. I agree, I said. I'm truly sorry, she added. Richard can be traditional. That's one word for it. She hesitated, then asked quietly, Do you love my son? I do, I said truthfully. But love isn't a uniform. It can't cover everything. Her sigh was soft, almost a whisper. I hope he learns that sooner than his father did. So did I. Days passed. I went back on duty at Norfolk. Rotation orders had come through faster than expected. My CO looked surprised to see me volunteer. Didn't you have a wedding coming up, Lane? Postponed, sir. Weather's more predictable. He smirked. Copy that. Welcome home. Home was a steel-gray office inside a hangar that hummed with generators. Paper maps still lined the walls. We didn't trust digital alone. Storm season was coming early, and with it, chaos. The work steadied me: logistics, schedules, relief routes, concrete things that didn't depend on anyone's approval. That night I bunked on base. The rain came harder, tapping the metal roof like Morse code. I lay awake thinking of Ethan, his soft-spoken decency trapped under generations of pride. I didn't hate him, I just couldn't follow him into silence. The following week brought news an approaching storm off the Atlantic stronger than forecasted cutting power to half the coast. Our unit mobilized. We worked through the night setting up command tents and evacuation grids. At 3 a.m., a call crackled over the radio. Civilian nursing home flooded access road, multiple trapped. I volunteered before they finished the sentence. By dawn, we'd evacuated 48 residents through knee-high water. One man clutched a photo of his wife the entire time. Another kept thanking the boys, not realizing one of those boys was a woman in soaked combat boots. When the last patient was lifted into the ambulance, the sun broke through like mercy. I stood there drenched and exhausted, but at peace. 3 days later, a local news crew aired footage from that mission. They caught me in frame helmet off mud streaked across my face, giving orders with a calm I didn't feel. The caption read, "Navy SEAL officer leads late-night rescue at Norfolk Base." I didn't think much of it until my phone started buzzing again. Texts, calls, missed numbers. One was from Ethan. "Saw the report, proud of you, can we talk?" Another unexpected from Margaret Whitmore. "You were remarkable. Richard watched the news 3 times. I stared at that message for a long moment. Somewhere in a house filled with marble and chandeliers, a man who once called me cheap was watching me pull strangers out of floodwater. And maybe, just maybe, learning a new language. The invitation arrived 3 days later, thick cream paper embossed in gold like nothing had happened. The Whitmore Lane rehearsal dinner, Saturday, 6 p.m., Boston Harbor Club. I stared at it a long time before sliding it into the trash. But life, like the Navy, has a way of pulling you back into unfinished business. The next morning, Ethan called. "Harper," he said quietly, "please come. Dad wants to talk. He's different." "Different how?" "He's been watching the Norfolk footage on repeat. He told me he didn't realize you were still active duty. He might want to apologize." Might. That word hung in the air like an unfinished order. Still, part of me wanted to see him not for revenge, but closure. So I agreed. Saturday evening, I stood in front of my closet, fingers brushing the sleeve of my navy blazer. Then I stopped. No, not tonight. I didn't want the uniform to speak for me. Instead, I chose a simple navy blue dress, modest sharp lines, the kind of thing that said discipline without rank. The Boston Harbor Club gleamed like a ship at anchor glass walls reflecting sunset over the water. Inside, laughter silverware and the practiced music of wealth. Ethan met me at the entrance. His relief looked almost painful. "You came." "I did," I said. "Let's get through it." He tried to smile. "Dad's been quieter lately." "That'll be a nice change." When we entered, the room turned slightly, just as it always does when someone unexpected walks in. Margaret was the first to approach. She took my hands gently. "Harper, it's wonderful to see you," she said, her voice softer than before. "You look lovely." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore." She glanced over her shoulder. "Richard's in the corner. He asked to speak with you privately before dinner." Ethan squeezed my arm. "I'll be right here." I nodded and crossed the room. Richard stood by the window staring out at the harbor. The reflection of twilight rippled across his face, the same face that once looked down on me like a judge. "Commander Lane," he said, turning with a faint smile. "Or is it Lieutenant Commander?" "Lieutenant Commander," I said, "but tonight just Harper." He nodded. "Harper, then." A long pause, the kind that asks for grace before words arrive. "I saw the broadcast," he began. "The rescue in Norfolk. You led that." "Yes, sir." His throat worked once before he said, "I misjudged you." I waited. "I mistook quiet for weakness," he continued. "That's a habit among men of my generation. We think noise equals strength." "It doesn't," I said. "No," he admitted, "it doesn't." He gestured toward the harbor. "My first posting overseas was in Berlin, 1979. I thought I understood courage. But I never stood in rising water with lives depending on me." "You did in your own way," I said. "Diplomacy saves people too, just not always visibly." He smiled faintly. I'm not sure my kind ever risked much beyond embarrassment. I studied him, this man who'd wielded language like a weapon, now fumbling for peace. Embarrassment can drown a soul faster than water, I said. He met my eyes, then let me swim. It wasn't an apology in words, but it was one in tone. I don't hold grudges, Mr. Whitmore, I said. Just memories and lessons. He nodded. I'd like to learn both. When we returned to the main room, Ethan exhaled, visibly relieved. Dinner began, and for the first time, conversation didn't feel like a duel. Someone toasted to service and family. Richard's glass tilted toward me. Margaret added quietly and humility. The room chuckled gently, and I let myself smile. But peace like the tide never holds still for long. Halfway through dessert, one of Ethan's partners, a smug man with the kind of charm that spoils, fast raised his glass. To Ethan and Harper, he said, "The Navy's gain is Boston's loss." Laughter. I smiled politely. He continued, "So tell us, Commander, how does a SEAL end up with a lawyer? I mean, you two live in different worlds." Before I could answer, Richard's voice cut through. "They live in the same one now, one built on service." The partner laughed awkwardly. Of course, didn't mean anything by it. But something in the room had shifted. The hierarchy had flattened. For once, Richard wasn't looking down. After dinner, Ethan walked me out to the terrace. The city lights shimmered on the water. "I don't know what you said to him," he said, "but thank you." I didn't say much, I replied. He just finally listened. Ethan nodded slowly. "I told him I almost lost you." "Almost," I teased. He took my hand. "Still might if you want it that way." I looked out at the harbor, thinking about every storm I'd weathered in uniform and out. I don't run from hard things, I said, but I don't stay where I'm not respected. He tightened his grip. "Then let's build respect, not just for you, but between all of us. My father wants to host something after the wedding, something for veterans. He said it's time his family gave back." That caught me off guard. He said that... He did. Maybe it was guilt, maybe growth. Either way, it was movement in the right direction. As the night ended, Richard approached me one last time at the door. "Harper," he said, "there's an old German saying, Ehre wem Ehre gebührt." I smiled. Honor to whom honor is due. He nodded. Exactly. Then he extended his hand again, but this time he added a quiet, "Thank you." I took it firm and steady. "You're welcome." Ethan put an arm around me as we walked to the car. The breeze carried the smell of salt and city sharp, honest, real. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "everything starts new." "Tomorrow," I echoed, "we earn it." The next morning I woke to news reports about the storm aftermath in Virginia, civilian volunteers, helping with cleanup, Navy personnel coordinating relief. The same anchor who had covered my rescue story now read a new headline. Veterans' families pledge support for ongoing relief efforts. The segment showed several private donors stepping up, and among them the Whitmore Foundation. Margaret's statement appeared on screen. "Service and sacrifice deserve more than words. Our family is honored to help." Below that, a photo Richard shaking hands with a group of veterans outside the VA hospital. He looked different, not younger but lighter. I turned off the TV and smiled. The wedding might still be uncertain, but something else was already repaired. Some debts aren't paid in money, they're paid in understanding. That evening, as I packed for another short deployment, I found myself folding the same navy blue dress into my duffel, the one he'd once called cheap. Funny how fabric doesn't change, only the eyes that see it. The next morning began with a familiar voice on the radio, the low, steady tone of a morning news anchor. In national headlines today, a U.S. Navy SEAL officer, Lieutenant Commander Harper Lane, led a heroic rescue during last week's Norfolk floods, saving 48 civilians and hospital staff. My coffee went cold in my hand. They even pronounced my name correctly. For once, no one asked who my father was, where I'd gone to school, or whether I looked the part. Just what I'd done. By noon, the story was everywhere. Clips of the mission-blurred faces, body cams, rescue boats cutting through black water played on every major network. The footage showed our team waist-deep in chaos, flashlights slicing through rain. My voice came faintly through the static. "Go, go, go, move them to higher ground." I hadn't realized they'd caught that moment. By mid-afternoon, my inbox overflowed old friends, shipmates, people from Iowa I hadn't heard from in years. And then among them a short email. From Margaret Whitmore. Subject: You were extraordinary. Richard watched the news. He hasn't said much, but he's been quiet all morning. Just thoughtful. I think something shifted, M. That evening I returned to my apartment and found an envelope slipped under the door, my name written in a man's careful, unfamiliar hand. Inside was a single folded sheet, heavy paper, faint cologne. Commander Lane. I owe you an apology that words can't balance, but I'll begin anyway. Watching those reports, I realized I've spent too long measuring people by inheritance instead of integrity. That was arrogance dressed as tradition. You didn't just save lives in that flood, you saved mine from a kind of blindness. Thank you for letting me see. Richard Whitmore. I sat for a long time, the letter trembling in my hand. I'd faced men who'd fired weapons at me without fear, but this quiet humility, this fragile courage from an old man, that nearly broke me. For the first time in days I cried, not from hurt but from release. It wasn't victory, it was peace. 2 days later, my commanding officer called me into his office. Lane, he said the Pentagon wants someone to represent the Norfolk Rescue Team at the upcoming Veterans Charity Gala in D.C. You're being volunteered. I raised an eyebrow. Volunteered, sir. He smiled. You clean up better than most of us, and they want a woman's voice at the podium. Yes, sir, I said, hiding the nerves under habit. I'd faced gunfire, survived storms, and debated admirals. But the thought of standing at a microphone in a ballroom of strangers, that was a different kind of battle. The gala was held at the Mayflower Hotel, chandeliers, velvet curtains, the scent of money trying to prove it cared. The crowd was full of politicians, business leaders, and retired officers. When I arrived, the coordinator handed me the itinerary. I glanced down the list of sponsors and froze. Whitmore Foundation. There it was, printed cleanly among major donors. I exhaled slowly, of course. Life doesn't send coincidences, it sends callbacks. I took my seat near the back, surrounded by laughter and champagne. Across the room I spotted them, Richard and Margaret, dressed in quiet elegance. He looked thinner but calmer. Their eyes found me. He gave a small nod. Not the commanding one from before, this time a gesture of respect. When the MC finally called my name, I walked to the stage in my dress white uniform, polished, formal, the one I hadn't worn since Afghanistan. The applause was polite at first, then grew. Not loud, not wild, just warm, honest human. I adjusted the microphone and began. Good evening. My name is Lieutenant Commander Harper Lane, United States Navy. A few weeks ago I was knee-deep in floodwater helping strangers climb into rescue boats. Tonight I'm standing here dry, warm, and grateful because hundreds of others did their jobs so that we could all go home. People ask what it feels like to lead a mission like that. Truth is, leadership isn't loud. It's listening when others panic. It's showing calm until calm becomes contagious. The room stayed silent, listening. I continued. We all wear uniforms of some kind. Some say Navy, some say police, some say father or mother or teacher. What matters isn't what we wear, it's who we serve. Applause followed, gentle but real. Then I ended. My father once told me, don't let anyone tell you your worth, you show them. I think he was right. The room rose to its feet. After the event, as people mingled, Richard approached. He looked at the uniform a little differently this time, not as a novelty, but as a mirror. You speak better than most diplomats, he said quietly. Occupational hazard, I replied. He smiled. You know, my foundation began as a scholarship fund. I think it's time it included veterans, especially women returning to civilian life. Would you consider advising us? I blinked. You're serious? Entirely, he said. I'd like to understand a world I once dismissed. I studied him a moment, then extended my hand. I'll think about it. He shook it. Fair. Though I hope you'll say yes in any language. That night, I drove home along the Potomac windows, down city lights streaking by like quiet applause. I thought about Ethan, who had texted me earlier that day. Proud of you. Dad's been telling everyone he knows a SEAL who speaks 5 languages. I think you broke him in the best way. I didn't reply, not yet. Some things needed silence to grow back properly. When I got home, I folded the dress white jacket over a chair and reread Richard's letter once more. The paper was creased, worn, but honest. People like him rarely say sorry, they act it. And maybe that's better. Because in the end, I hadn't needed his humiliation or his praise, just his recognition that respect isn't charity. It's duty. Before bed, I stepped onto the balcony. The night breeze carried the faint hum of the city horn's laughter siren's life. Somewhere, I imagined a father was telling his son about the woman who had once answered him in perfect German. Not to embarrass him, but to remind him some lessons are learned best in translation. The next week passed like quiet aftermath. No storms, no dinners, just space. Ethan's number appeared on my phone every evening, and every evening I let it fade to voicemail. His messages stayed kind, but clumsy. Can we start over? Dad's a different man now. Mom wants to see you. I didn't ignore him out of spite. I just needed distance long enough to trust what I was feeling wasn't anger. When you've served long enough, you learn the danger of reaction. The first punch isn't always the one that wins the fight. It's the one that teaches you when to hold steady. Friday morning, I stopped by the VA hospital before heading back to base. The volunteers were gathering supplies for an outreach program, blankets, toiletries, letters. Commander Lane, the director, said, smiling, "Mail came for you." He handed me a heavy envelope sealed with wax, the kind people used before emails replaced apologies. Inside was a note written in familiar looping script. "Dear Harper, I suspect you've received Richard's letter. He asked me not to send this one, but I think you deserve both voices. For years I stayed silent while my husband's pride spoke for the family. Watching you that night, how you carried yourself, how you answered him without cruelty, reminded me what grace looks like when it refuses to bend. He's not the same man. You changed him. We both know words can wound. Now he's learning they can also heal. If you ever forgive us enough to share dinner again, our table will be open. No languages, no tests, just family. With love, Margaret." I stood in the hallway for a while, letting the paper rest against my palm. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint perfume from the letter lavender old-fashioned genuine. When I folded it back into the envelope, my hands didn't tremble anymore. That afternoon, Ethan showed up at the base. I saw him through the window before the gate guards called. He was wearing civilian clothes, no arrogance, just exhaustion. He waited while I finished briefing the relief team. When I finally stepped outside, the wind carried salt and jet fuel grounding and real. "I shouldn't have come here unannounced," he said, "but if I asked permission, you'd have said no." "You're not wrong." He smiled weakly. "That's a first." We stood in silence, watching a helicopter descend on the tarmac. Dust lifted stinging eyes, forcing us to squint. "Dad's writing letters now," he said when the noise faded. "To people he hasn't spoken to in years. To veterans he worked with overseas. I think you gave him the courage to look backward." "I didn't give him courage," I said. "He already had it. I just held up a mirror." Ethan nodded slowly. "He keeps saying your name like a medal he didn't earn." "That's not the point." "I know, but it means something to him and to me. I wanted to thank you." I studied his face. There were new lines, subtle ones that come from reflection. "What do you want, Ethan?" He hesitated. Another chance. Not to redo the wedding, just to talk without anyone else's expectations in the room. "Where?" I asked. "The VA hospital. Saturday. Mom's coordinating a donation drive there. Dad's coming too. It's not a trap, I promise." I took a slow breath. 1 hour. "That's all I'm asking." Saturday morning, the VA lobby buzzed with activity volunteers packing care boxes, veterans chatting, sunlight streaming through high windows. It smelled of coffee and disinfectant, but also something cleaner: sincerity. Margaret spotted me first. She looked genuinely happy, the kind of joy that doesn't perform. "Harper," she said, touching my arm. "You came." I said I would. She gestured toward the donation table stacked with supplies. "We're calling it Operation Gratitude." Richard thought the name sounded too sentimental, but I told him it's time he tried sentimental for once. I smiled. "He's here." "In the reading room." When I entered, Richard was sitting at a long table surrounded by veterans. He was helping an elderly Marine fill out a benefits form, reading the fine print aloud, slow and careful. The sight stopped me cold. Not because of what he was doing, but because of how he was doing it with humility. When he noticed me, he rose immediately. "Commander." "Sir." He gestured for me to sit. "I hope you don't mind. I borrowed your example." Looks like you improved it, I said. He smiled faintly. I wanted to thank you in person. Not the kind of thank you that ends in a headline, the kind that means I finally understand. I nodded. You don't owe me that. Maybe not, but I owe it to myself. He looked down at his hands. When I called you cheap, I wasn't talking about your dress. I was talking about myself, about the smallness I mistook for sophistication. That's a good start, I said softly. He chuckled. My wife says humility is the new luxury. Smart woman. He looked up again, eyes steadier. Would you forgive an old man for being ignorant? I already did, I said, that night at the dinner table. I just needed you to catch up. Ethan appeared in the doorway carrying coffee. You two talking. We're finished, I said. For now. Richard stood and extended his hand again. Thank you, Commander Lane. I shook it firmly. It's Harper. He smiled. It's Richard. When he left the room, Ethan lingered. So he said quietly, Where do we go from here? Forward, I said. Maybe not together right now, but forward. He nodded slowly, the kind of acceptance that costs something. I'll take that, and if the door ever opens again? You'll knock, I said. He laughed, always. After they left, I stayed behind to help the volunteers. As I packed boxes, a young Navy medic asked Ma'am, Was that the Whitmore the diplomat guy? Yes. Didn't he used to, Yes, I said, he did, but people change. The medic smiled. Good to know. When we finished, the director came by holding a small envelope. This was dropped off for you, he said. Inside was a check substantial and a note. For the Harper Lane Veterans Scholarship Fund. Every mission deserves a return path home. R.W. I stared at it stunned. He'd taken my story and turned it into legacy. I slipped the note into my pocket, whispered to myself, Good job, old man, and went back to work. That evening, I drove to the shoreline. The sun was dipping below the horizon, the sky burning gold and navy, the same colors as my uniform. I thought about how everything had started with a dinner invitation, an insult, and a glass of wine. And how it ended with a letter, a handshake, and quiet respect. Sometimes the battles that matter most aren't fought overseas. They're fought at dinner tables across generations between pride and humility. And when you win them, no medals are pinned. The only reward is peace. I sat until the last light faded. Somewhere in Boston, Richard was probably still writing letters. Margaret was probably still organizing care drives. And Ethan, well, he was learning that love isn't measured by the size of a wedding, but by the courage to change. I took one last look at the water and whispered, Mission complete. 2 months later, I stood in front of a mirror at the Mayflower Hotel once again, this time in full Navy mess dress blues. The jacket fit like discipline. The medals gleamed under the warm light, polished but not showy. It wasn't a wedding gown, but it felt more honest. Tonight wasn't about vows or apologies. It was about something rarer, understanding. The Veterans Charity Gala had grown beyond anyone's expectations. More than 500 guests filled the ballroom, service members, families, donors, and even a few faces I hadn't expected to see again. Among them, Richard and Margaret Whitmore seated together near the front, their foundation's logo printed proudly on the program. Their name was now followed by a line that read, In partnership with the Harper Lane Veterans Transition Fund. I hadn't asked for that. Richard had insisted. The MC introduced the evening, his voice smooth as a radio host's. Tonight's closing remarks will be delivered by Lieutenant Commander Harper Lane, U.S. Navy SEALs Intelligence Division, whose story, as many of you know, inspired this very foundation to expand its mission of support. Applause swelled, respectful and warm. As I walked to the podium, I saw Richard stand first, then slowly the rest of the room followed. A standing ovation before I'd spoken a single word. I took a breath, steady, deliberate, and began. Good evening. I'm honored to be here tonight, surrounded by people who understand that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. 2 months ago, I was knee-deep in floodwater helping strangers climb into rescue boats. Tonight, I'm standing on dry ground, not because I'm extraordinary, but because others pulled with me. That's what service really is, pulling together. I paused, letting the words find their place. The audience was quiet, listening the way soldiers listen to a final briefing. I used to think courage meant never breaking. But I've learned it's the opposite. Courage is what happens when we break and still choose to rebuild in ourselves and in others. A ripple of nods spread through the crowd. I've seen bravery on battlefields and in hospitals and classrooms and kitchens. I've seen it in widows writing letters to strangers and in fathers learning to say, "I was wrong." Sometimes the hardest wars are fought in silence across generations between pride and forgiveness. My eyes found Richard and Margaret. They were holding hands. "I want to share one small story," I said. "A few months ago, I was invited to dinner at a family's home. It didn't go well." The audience chuckled softly. At that dinner, someone made a comment about how I looked, a comment meant to belittle spoken in another language. What he didn't know was that I understood every word. Laughter, then a hush. So I replied in perfect German. The room laughed again, warmer this time. But what mattered wasn't the comeback. It was what came after. Because that same man later taught me something I'll never forget. It's never too late to learn a new language, not of words, but of humility. You could feel the emotion shift from amusement to reflection. We all speak different languages. Some of us speak through medals and service records, others through silence or love or regret. But the only language that connects us all is respect. Applause began quietly, then grew stronger, richer. I finished with a quote my father had once written on the back of a photograph. "Honor isn't about who you impress, it's about who you lift." Then I stepped back from the microphone. The applause was thunderous now, but what moved me most wasn't the sound, it was Richard. He stood again this time unprompted and raised his glass. In clear, deliberate German, he said, "Ehre wem Ehre gebührt." And then switching to English, "Honor to whom honor is due." He smiled at me, not the politician's smile, but the father's one. The audience joined in, glasses raised. Margaret leaned toward him and whispered something that made him laugh quietly. For a man who once measured worth in pedigree, that laugh was its own redemption song. Later, as the gala wound down, Richard approached me in the hallway outside the ballroom. The noise of conversation faded behind us. "You spoke beautifully," he said. "You always did. I just didn't listen soon enough." "It takes time to translate pride into understanding," I said. He nodded. "You were right that night about the suit and the dress. Sometimes the one who looks refined is just better at hiding fear." "I think we both learned something," I said. He looked down at the medal on my uniform. "I used to see these and think they were about bravery. Now I know they're about responsibility. That's the only kind worth wearing." He extended his hand once more, a ritual now, but one that carried meaning. If you ever decide to leave active duty, our foundation could use someone who understands both worlds. Someone who speaks many languages. I smiled. I'll keep that in mind. As he turned to go, he said softly, "You remind me of my daughter, the one I wanted Ethan to marry." I raised an eyebrow. I was that daughter. He paused, laughed, and said, "Yes, you were." Outside, the city shimmered under a thin rain, not a storm this time, just a soft drizzle that polished everything clean. I walked down the steps toward the curb, the echo of applause fading into the hum of traffic. Ethan was waiting by the entrance. He looked older too, not by years, but by lessons learned. "I almost didn't come," he admitted. "Dad insisted." I'm glad he did. So am I. We stood in the rain a moment, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. Then he said, "You know, I replay that night sometimes. The dinner. The look on your face when you answered him. It was the first time I realized what real strength looks like." I smiled. It wasn't strength, it was patience, stronger medicine. He chuckled. "So what now? Do I get a second chance?" I shook my head gently. "We already got one. We just used it differently." He nodded slowly, accepting. "I'll take that." We hugged not as lovers rekindled, but as people who finally understood each other's battles. When he pulled away, he whispered, "Semper Fi." I laughed. "Wrong branch, counselor." Then he said, smiling, "How do the seals say goodbye?" "Huya," I answered softly. As I walked toward the car, I thought about everything that had happened, the dinner, the insult, the silence, the rescue, the letter, the gala. Each moment had felt like an ending. But maybe every ending is just another translation of the same lesson. Respect doesn't need permission. It just needs courage to show up. To everyone listening now, wherever you are, remember this. Sometimes the smallest words carry the greatest power. Sometimes "I'm sorry" is stronger than "I'm right." And sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones who understand every language of the heart. If this story moved, you take a moment to share it with someone who's still waiting for an apology, or someone who once gave one. And if you've ever learned a hard lesson late in life, know that late is still on time. Because honor isn't about winning, it's about listening.